Well, I hope Cosmo doesn't frighten you. They're quite friendly, really. You must be puzzled why I talk about the bear in the plural. Some people think it's a male bear just because it's in blue. See the conventions we're stuck in. All right, I ended up with the wonderful notion that I had an honest student who said to me, look, Phil, I'm just here to get the bucks, to get the credits, get the job, settle down in suburbia. That's an honest reaction. And I say it's wonderful because it's a welcome honesty. There's a level of cultural dishonesty where we pretend that we are living significantly and we resent the other. Resentment is a tremendous, it's much better in French to say ressentiment, a surge of feeling against the largeness of the other. Talking about, say, Beethoven and Emma. And the honesty to say, I am much more comfortable as a zombie, and I want my children to be zombies, and we live in little boxes, and we'll all grow up and get other little boxes. The uncomfortable zone is the gray zone of resenting dishonesty, the belittling of the great person. And that takes on the guise of academic competence. Now, we've talked about scientific in the last few weeks. What is scientific? I quoted Webster's dictionary, and we went over that in detail. Why? Because it's relevant in thinking about the institutions in which we live. Scientific was defined in a way that excluded insight. You collected data. And that's the pattern of bureaucracy, of committee meetings, of government, and unfortunately of academic aesthetic studies. And one has to face in oneself the possibility that that is there. There's a resentment of my notion of an exercise that might take you 10 years. And yet I'm making a claim that I am not more than averagely stupid, and this stuff takes time. Now, we will get to the notion of roots. And I will appeal to that aspect of Zen Buddhism, or the three traditions of Buddhism, about taking time. That there's another type of lifestyle that recognizes the years of reaching, and reaching for the roots. But before going on, I want to talk a little bit further about the process. I know we're not going to sweep through these final points, but it's important to do these exercises in a way that you can relate it to the sufferings you are enduring. So we're back with Emma and Ludwig. I talked about Beethoven's process of the leap. And it's not one great leap of insight. You have the mess of musical possibilities. And you have the constant living, walking, moving around the world, visiting friends, being distressed, uncomfortable about not hearing, operations, and so on. And after a couple of years, the Seventh Symphony. Now, the creative process, you have a medium, an image, inviting an image with feelings, and they're not comparable. And as I've mentioned a few times before, there's the paradox that the people who find that they're not comparable are the people who climb up the hill a certain distance. Chopin trying to play Bach, Mahler reaching back to Mozart, von Karajan saying Beethoven's always new. Ashkenazi. That insofar as one has struggled, one reveals that one has got nowhere. And that's related both to the Socratic tradition and to the Zen tradition. Okay, the images and feelings, this is the background, and one literally changes the habits of one's molecules. One tunes in, one refines. Now, the problem of the scientific approach, whatever, the teaching of the arts, is that just as scientific can lead you to collect data, names, facts, formulae, so you can actually bypass this. The image doesn't expand you molecularly. There isn't the reaching that forms the images into artistic units, and the feelings are excluded. And again, go back to my list and think of perhaps courses you've done in one of these subjects. One of my friends has suffered through a music degree in a university not a million miles away, and she listened to the professors crucifying Beethoven. This is all he did. So that eventually you're prevented from actually expanding. I heard a British philosopher talking recently, and he said, I just survived Cambridge by not reading. This is Cambridge, England. So I'm not just talking about North America. There's a way in which one is not invited in that way in which art invites. I can use an old story of an Irish playwright when he was asked what he thought about the critics. Oh, he said, does a lamppost like dogs? Okay, so the problem is that you can be well versed in art and not have any aesthetic experience. Bernard Lonergan uses the very nice little word, effete. That you can be competent in the history of art. Know the names, dates, and identify all the paintings. And you've never been present to any of them. Now, this may have happened to you. And again, insofar as you are within that elite, you may resent the notion that you've never seen a Picasso. I heard a commentator once talking about an exhibition, it was in Montreal, of a series of paintings Picasso did after the death of a friend. And he painted for 2 years. The death of the friend. And this idiot commentator said, you must visit this exhibition, you'll enjoy it. Wow. Okay, so the problem of the process is that the artist generally doesn't fit into the institutions, like Cézanne, Degas, Van Gogh, Mozart, Joyce. But you can institutionalize the arts to the extent that just as in science there's an exclusion of insight, so in art there's an exclusion of both insight and image and feeling. Okay, roots. And again, we're back to the question of honesty. You may be honest like the student who says, well, this isn't for me. I need the credits and the big bucks, and I need the first canoe and the second canoe and the 2.5 bambinos. Okay. But you may be less honest and consider that this is all very well, but we've got to live a real life. I don't want to reach for the roots. There is a movement, in fact, towards roots, and it's very much associated with Zen Buddhist meditation. That's why I mention it more than other types of Oriental religion. That all this institutional structure that I've been talking about has negatively invited people to move towards roots. Now, what are the roots I'm talking about? Well, I'm obviously talking about, I put the circle around it, the embodied quest that we are. And what is it to search for these roots? Now, there's a key point here relating East and West, if you like, and criticizing Western philosophy. And that is that the search for roots is a search for the formless self. The self that is prized in the Zen tradition. I have a book here. It might be of use to some people to have the reference, Zen and the Fine Arts by Shinichi Hisamatsu. It's a paperback since 1985, Random House. And it has a very nice section on the Zen basis and the problem of the formless true self. And again, it would be a very good exercise in reading to approach this from the background of the elements. Even on the very first page of this discussion, he mentions the problem of the ideas of good, beauty, truth. Well, from our work, we now know that these belong on different levels. Yes? Okay, so we've got these levels of yearning in us for beauty. Understanding is regularly missed, whether it's in the Zen tradition or in the tradition of Maslow. There's the yearning for beauty, the yearning for truth, the yearning for goodness, the yearning for love. It's a curious fact that there isn't an emphasis on this, and it's possibly due to the absence of understanding in either tradition. The serious following of the what question, and the what question is, oddly, the root. I've been emphasizing that right through the course. The Hebrew meaning of Emma, ma in Hebrew, the whatter. The Bhagavad Gita, what then is being human? Yes, what? That rootedly we are whatters reaching for understanding, coherence, and somehow we're bypassing it. Now, rooting for the root means that one actually moves towards a self-attention to oneself as a whatter. And that is not seriously appreciated in the Western tradition because of a tendency towards linguistic education. We know the names. In Bernard Lonergan's Insight, the phrase is used in the introduction, notio entis, notion. St. Thomas Aquinas' notion of being. Okay. Now, I've been oscillating backwards and forwards since last week. Thomas Aquinas, retrieving Thomas Aquinas, whether it's Joyce or Lonergan. St. Thomas Aquinas talks about a notion of being. Now, what's St. Thomas Aquinas talking about? St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay. Just like Ludwig Beethoven is a notion of the Seventh Symphony. Does that make sense? he becomes the Seventh Symphony and then brings it forth. And many of you saw the film about Mozart, Amadeus, and Salieri is given Mozart's music, and he holds the stuff and he reads it and he drops it. And his reaction, there are no corrections. He wrote it out. And Mozart not only wrote it out like that, there were occasions when he was bowling with friends and then he went over and sat on a bench and he wrote out what he was really doing. A notion of the Seventh Symphony, a notion of being. Thomas Aquinas writes about a notion of being. He's writing about himself. I am desire. St. Augustine says, are we not an abyss? What's the abyss? The abyss is the what? And it's that abyss to which there is appeal in any of these art forms. And I'm not going further into the appeal on the other levels. This is a profoundly basic appeal. And the cultivation of it requires an attention to self as a water. Now, I won't move further into this Zen tradition. The Japanese writer talks about the fact that this is formless but dynamic. Yes, it's a dynamic desire, a yearning. The other leads I give on it are the leads, say, in the epilogue of Wealth of Self, being and loneliness. A cultivation of the loneliness that is the water requires a certain attention, which is discomforting. And that's why it's nice to have the honesty of somebody who doesn't want that discomfort. I prefer to be busy. But there are the other people, and again I'm thinking of the large movement towards the Zen tradition in both Europe and North America, who somehow want to find this self. And it's a pointer coming from the Orient back to an invitation issued by Socrates. Now, the Buddha is 2 centuries ahead of Socrates in the Orient. To discover oneself as a water, a tradition that one can glean is that Socrates was a very strange, mystical person. He could be found halted, paused on the street. He was getting into his whatting. Okay, so that's the question of roots. And the roots can be reached for in the presence of the artistic object. And that artistic object, maybe, like the furry bear, what is the reach of the roots? Now, this is an enormous topic, the reaching of the root. We ended last day with some notion of the Christian Trinity. And if you remember my curious diagram, a helpful diagram helping us to think about the meaning of the Trinity as it evolved through Augustine and Aquinas and others. All right, we'll put in speaker and listener. And that's the way I introduced it, with the arrows in these directions, by my 4 questions. I'll repeat the 4 questions. You want some notion of the Christian Trinity. As that notion emerged, the notion of being in Aquinas, a notion of being at its best, which is triune. Then you have to think about yourself in the presence of conversation. Now, this can get very tricky when you make the conversation yourself and being, but let's take an ordinary conversation. So I raised the question, when did you last have a real conversation with your shrink? 10 years ago? Whatever. When were you last understanding, understood? When did you last speak? When did you last listen? These are all questions, and they're questions that root for the roots. And you can notice that they are not tied to the Trinitarian theology of Aquinas. They're questions about us listening to a concert, being in conversation with Beethoven. Okay, so these four questions in Thomas's, in my view, help you to read Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, question 27 on. That in the infinite being, limitless understanding that is God, there is an infinite speaker, speaking infinitely, a one identical with the speaker, a wow, calling forth an identical ha. Listening, and that sharing, again, the question of our line comes in on page 203. The sharing of this immense celebration is cunningly devised as an invitation to listen, empty listening, the root, invited through a presence of the listener. You'll find this on page 203 in that integrating diagram. A listening within the cosmos, to the cosmos. That's the reach of the roots, in fact, the cosmos. But what cosmos? The cosmos that includes, in the fullness of time, which is a beginning, that was the point last week, the spring. It includes the incarnation, the sensuousness of a divine person, transforming the boundaries I started with at the beginning, within and without the lines of art. There is a presence of a divine person breathing our air. So the cosmos listened to includes a divine word, a sensuous divine word, and I jokingly suggested that the return of this person may be with the sensuousness of a woman. Thomas Aquinas had no problem. I'm sure some people will find this strange. Question 3, Article 7 in the third part of the Summa. These three persons can be any human nature altogether, or any one of them can be many humans, so on. But the convenience of, at this time and place in the Mediterranean patriarchal tradition, being sensibilized as a male, changing the cosmic reach of the quest. I sum that up, and I think it's on page 212 of Process, by twisting around a poem of an Irish hero, one of the Irishmen executed in 1916 for trying to shake off the British Empire. One cynic remarked that the executions of the revolutionary leaders in 1916, he said, well, at least it got rid of a few bad poets. There were reasonably good poets in two languages. The one I'm thinking of, the one I quote here, is Joseph Mary Plunkett. who has a poem that says, I see his blood upon the rose, and in the stars the glory of his eyes. His body gleams amid eternal snows, his tears fall from the skies. And I twisted the words so that the first lines read, I see the rose within his blood, and in his eyes the glory of the stars. And now you get a Trinitarian perspective on art. That in fact there is a presence in the cosmos that can be focused in art. There are a lot of subtle points here of breaking down the sacred and the secular and so on. But what is the actual reach? I would say the actual reach then is a reach for the cosmic word that is personally divine and sensuous, to which we should be rooting. It's the root of us. Again, there's a theology of resurrection and so on in this. So what is me? Me is a desire reaching for a redeemer, a cosmic redeemer. Within the Christian tradition, that is identified much more precisely than within, say, the Taoist, the Zen, the Hindu, the Muslim, the Jewish, Zoroastrian, whatever. And it is a reach for a cosmic word. And all I can say at this stage, there's a double direction here. I'm moving towards the end of the book process. And one of the amusing things is that the end of the book process is on page 3 of the book Insight. But also I'm moving towards the first page of the book process. It should be interesting to go back to that first page and look at the dancers and the quotation about aesthetic apprehension. And that's the meaning of that phrase. And it takes a lot of rooting to get towards that. Now, I could carry forward, but I'm saving it for the last day, towards the movement forward insofar as we became luminous about this root, insofar as the elements were revealed in culture and manifest to school children, there would be a shift in culture. And again, take the simple problem of defining science, not as a collection of data, but as a strenuous messing creatively to have a whoopee of insight. Can you imagine the school system if that was going on? It'd be explosive. When that breakthrough occurs, there is the possibility of a quite different cultural situation. And I identified that as a shift through the dynamics of charity to a presence of attention to the cosmic word that is creative, so that one moves to a type of living that is explicitly hopeful about the cosmos. I could associate that with people who struggle with the notion of the convergence of world religions. And later I may talk a little more about the problem of the metta quest in Buddhism. A metta meditation in Buddhism is a meditation towards loving kindness of others. People sometimes think that the Zen tradition is an isolationist tradition. No, the Buddha tradition comes to a benevolence towards all. And this type of meditation is an effort to root towards a discovery of self as reaching out to all others, rooting. Now, what I'm going to move to shortly is the notion that this movement will have to be transformed gradually, no hurry, under the honesty of the conviction and the openness within that high religion. And back to the question of faith as a conviction. Recall the point I made that I drew a circle and talked about the faith as a conviction, the authenticity of which is its living with an openness to the cosmos. And this is an enormous problem in certain subgroups of the Christian tradition. There's a closedness, a selection of the redeemed, we and they. Now that openness is, I might say forced on us, but let's think of it as a calling. We are called to that openness by the cosmos as it moves through these centuries of the emergence of elementary science and the emergence of elementary technologies and the emergence of bad economics and bad government. These are all invitations to enlarge the searching for roots. And the surge of Zen interest in the last few decades cannot remain authentic in its searching for cosmos and continue to ignore that through the next 5 centuries. So we have this optimistic date, 2500 AD plus. And the great thing about this date for me is that I'm not going to be checked out. It's not as if I was saying the turn of the century. Okay. So that reach cannot be solitary and cannot be simple. We're back to the question of cosmogenetics. I'm thinking of my bear Cosmo that I called them, they. And I was amused in reflecting on Joyce and the moo cow on the first page of the portrait and the way he brings in stories of his childhood and rhymes and so on. I was recalling in my early school days we had hymns, and one of the hymns was one that included the line, "Gladly the cross-eyed bear." And the kids in the class all had this image of a cross-eyed bear. And it's really a wonderful image, and we all sang out, "Gladly the," or whatever, "Gladly the cross-eyed bear." But there's a sense in which I would bring together the reach that is within, say, the Zen tradition, the Buddhist discovering that suffering was part of the reality of life. And there's a sense in which that tradition can say, "Gladly the cross-eyed bear." But there's a sense in which the personality I was talking about last day, yeah, it's a cross-eyed divine nature. No, I won't put that in. There's an I, and there's a speaker, and there's a listener. So there's a sense in which I could rename Cosmo over there, called Cosmo Gladly. What's the divinity? Well, it's a sort of a cross-eyed bear. Okay, that should give you something to think about. All right, now cosmogenetics and the exercise. And what's our exercise? It's that homely exercise that we did a couple of weeks ago about the family on holidays. Yeah, you remember I invited you. I hope you've spent a couple of weeks on that, skipped all your other classes. We had this family, Poldy and Molly. And I think we had Jack and Jill. I forget what ages these were. I think they were 23. And we had Grandma Moses. What was she? I think she was about 45. And then we had Uncle Was it Cheng or Chang? Anyway, it was an international group who were going on holidays regularly, these two having inherited the cottage 20 miles north of Toronto when they were 23, and they went to the cottage every August for the next 20 years. And the holiday got more and more miserable. And we reflected on how would you rescue this holiday? So let's broaden the challenge. Those of you who have been working on it have picked up the broadness of the sweep in chapter 4 of process, which relates to chapter 10 of wealth of self. Chapter 10's title is Notion of Survival. The notion of survival. And to connect what we've been saying from the question of roots forward, the notion of survival is, again, Thomas Aquinas, you. To appreciate the notion of survival is to root for the roots. And my claim is that this is not part of the Western tradition of philosophy, a contemplative stance that roots for the roots. Now, my other claim is that the rooting for that root within the Oriental tradition has to take on the complexity that will meet the challenge of the cosmos as we live in it at the moment. So instead of the family, think of the family of the races and the global adventure. We're not in a cottage north of Toronto. We're on a little ball 30,000 light years away from the center of the galaxy or something like that. But we have the same problem. It's the same exercise. How do you get from the past to the future? You can't get there by amnesia. So we have the problem of recollection and the problem of projection. And for some of you, these are taking on the complexity of what I would call accumulated meaning from the previous classes. The word project no longer is a very simple word. You think of the project in the mind of Christ, which includes the Trinitarian project of bringing us all to the party slowly. And the project also includes the notion of mystery, which gives you the sense of maybe and springtime, that history is a nocturne of which we have heard the first few bars. I mentioned earlier the problem of writing Beethoven's 10th Symphony from scraps he left. We have no scraps of the next 10 million years. So it's quite a project. So now go back to the family holiday, and yes, what do? Well, you have the diagrams, point to the diagrams of the process of recollection and projection. And let's put them down in the most elementary form. And I'll even write these words. There's research. Keep it for the moment in terms of the family. There comes an evening, there comes a crisis. Again, you can think of that marvelous paragraph from Insight on page 36 of Process. When are there creative moments? In moments of distress, in the turbulence of personal disaster, etc. Things have just gone too far. Uncle Cheng comes in and says, "My God, I'm tired of coming up to this cottage every August." Grandma Moses is desperate for bingo. And Jill is in revolt. One of my class got a great thrill out of this because Jill was in revolt in the family. No way I'm going to that cottage. It's okay, you know, when you're... Jill and Jack were about 3, I think, when they inherited the cottage, and it's okay playing with ducks and stones and boats when you're 3 and 4 and 5, but you're 17, 18 and 19, yeah? You have better things to do. Okay, so the moment of revolt generates the possibility of creative thinking. And there might be the possibility of saying, well, let's gather ourselves. And there might be a really full and wholesome creativity. Well, okay, what has happened to us? We've been going to the cottage for 18 years. Well, then you can go through the random talking, stories, anecdotes, bitching, and dogging. We've got to be bisexual here. And blame. Yeah. Do you remember what you did to me and what I did to you and what? Yeah. And remember that summer you thought it was wonderful for you and all I was doing was waiting to get home. And, yeah. Spent all the time on the phone to my boyfriend. Yeah. Okay. But it may become more constructive. And then I suggest that this structure makes sense. Now, I talked about this the last day, the fact that it took Bernard Lonergan 10 years to break through from the elements, the 4 levels of sense, what is and is to be. Okay, and we sorted out the problem of those 4. I've dropped level 4, and we worked that out, that the what might be is not distinct. Your what question is not different intrinsically. It's different insofar as you're looking to the future or looking to the past. Is that fair enough? The cooking illustration? Yeah? But I use the Irish-English phrasing, what might that be? Where you're talking about the past. Who might that be at the door? Who might be knocking? But might be is also a way of looking to the future. What might we do? Okay, so those 4 levels, as I recalled, Lonergan saying, well, it's very simple. Double the structure. You look to the past, and you research the expressions, the sensible expressions of the human group. Now, in the case of the family, that's stones gathered on beaches, pieces of diaries, jottings. You can imagine the enormous honesty involved in, say, little Jack producing diaries he wrote when he was 10, and the things he said about Grandma Moses. Yeah? This is not a very comfortable process. You can think of a parallel, say, in, say, scripture studies and the research that brings forth the androcentric writings of, say, church members. Yeah? Try and cover that up. Okay, so the research bringing out indications from the past, not interpreted, just souvenirs, letters, information on the weather over the period, the level of pollution in the local lake, the condition of the house. Well, at least we got the house fixed in 1984. Before that, it was unbearable. No indoor plumbing, whatever. The interpretation, the aspirations of each. And then, as I mentioned, his and her story And then the problem, the dialectic problem, is to find out, well, what's the real story, and why, and what's good about it. Were there things that are good in the past, and why were they good? And the search, which I indicate, I suppose I should indicate it better that way, vortex fashion, a search that reveals, and again we've got the problem of names as opposed to roots. Page 52, wealth, last lines. It's almost amusing to answer the question, what will all this reveal? Basically, the book over there talks about a Zen basis. Anyone going to guess? What does all this work reveal? That we would be happier if we were human. Isn't it marvelous? If we were attentive, intelligent, reasonable, and responsible. If we were all kindly. And that's the foundational perspective. But now notice our problem. Our whole effort in the course is to bring us to notice these levels and to notice that we haven't noticed them. To be serious about the superficiality of our searchings. And that's the heavy task. These can become slogans in a pseudo-religion. Yeah? What does Bernard Lonergan say? Be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible. Wow, we've got it. And what does this constitute? It constitutes inattention, unintelligence, unreasonableness, and irresponsibility, and a neglect of the root. So what does all this reveal? Well, it depends on whether it's undertaken seriously. And so you're back to the question. That's why it's so important to do the exercise. If you slip from the exercise too quickly into the problem of religious studies, ecology, economy, etc., you too easily miss the impossibility of transformation. At this stage, apart from Jack and Jill's children, they're all too old to change. Yeah. Come on, let's be honest. Like the student I talked about, hey Phila, this is too much for me, I just need the credit. We need that honesty that, yeah, let's not be idiotically optimistic. The family get together and grace abounds, let's say. And really, yeah, let's see what we might do. Had we any good times? And the horror of finding out that, I think of Eugene O'Neill's marvelous Long Day's Journey into Night. Yeah, we're a hate group. Am I being sufficiently cheerful? Okay. So, the epiphany, to bring that forth, even as admitted, is an enormous achievement. Then to move forward to doing something about it is another field entirely. Okay, but my point here is, before we slip into the larger view, is to realize the impossibility of moving back into the root, to find out that I was the possibility of a kindly adult when I was 3. But I was manipulated by my parents, my uncle, my grandparents, the situation, the culture. I'm a wreck. Okay, I won't go down the hill or down through. If you'll notice in the other diagrams, I put the diagram up. This was the original diagram I picked up from Bernard Lonergan. It's just a matter of going up the levels and then down the levels from a foundational perspective to policy, basic truths picked out of history. A planning, an open planning that allows for this. This relates to the problem of institutions that build into them a critique of their own closure. My joke about a party, a government party, or a bureaucracy that votes itself out of existence doesn't happen too often. I can think of some parties and bureaucracies could vote themselves out of existence. We had a committee in the Mount, maybe about 8 years ago. We formed a committee to find out how many committees we had, and it gave up. Okay, policy, planning, it's the what question. What? What might be? And then, instead of this research sensible expression, you have a reflection, an executive reflection. Trying to connect up all these possible strategies with the situations as they emerge. Okay, we'll shift to, say, religious studies. I conjured up the problem of religious studies in two lectures ago. This zone is the zone of pastoral theology. In religious studies. And unless it's mediated by this, it becomes a trivialization of research, a jump from there to there. And you'll find that that characterizes a great deal of contemporary writings. I mentioned the good part of, say, feminist studies in the biblical tradition, and the revelation of biases and disorientations and androcentric foci. But also there's the bad side, that there's an urgency about somehow illuminating the present through insights into these remote peoples without going through the process of discovering the cosmos between the Old and New Testament and present times. Just skip out on a cosmic word. Okay, now this is a diagram that indicates a possibility of collaboration. It seems terribly complex. We need simpler processes. And yet, think of the family. It might be better if they revisited the past, picked up on odd things. What then about the larger task of the global effort? In religious studies, this solution emerged because the crisis was well focused by the emergence of religious disputes in the last 5 centuries, by the decay of Thomas's effort, that indeed the condemnation of Thomas, the splitting up of Christianity, the emergence of historical studies, the problems of is the Bible really true? And eventually you have a bundle of studies connected with the Bible, with interpreting scriptures, traditions, with the different histories of the West, not just Catholic and Lutheran and so on, but Marxists and that sort of thing. Disputes over the basis of either religion or reason. So it's a massive mess in religious studies that is solved by introducing this. Now, what is indicated in chapter 4 of process is that this is a solution to the mess in literature, ecology, economics. We need a simple solution. Yes, we do, but where will we get it? In economics, Nicholas Kaldor says that things went wrong in chapter 6 of book 1 of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. There's a mistake back there. Shouldn't we go back and find out what the mistake was? And one can, in fact, discover in the history of economics the sequence of mistakes connected with the neglect of Ricardo's suggestions, the neglect of rhythmic analysis in Quinet, the folly of the 1870s in economics that really grounded the LSIM curve, the canonization of a mistake in Keynes by Hicks in 1937, the neglect of Schumpeter's analysis in 1939 because the war was on and it got us out of trouble, and so on. In other words, there's a history based on misinterpretations. And one needs a recollection to lift us to quite new foundations, and quite new policy, and planning and execution. Now, in chapter 4, I go into the question of ecology. There has been recognized in the ecological literature a massive need for foundations, but they have to come from this. And this comes from a rooting, an openness to our cosmic past. And it's a huge task, a foundational quest. Are we up to it? We will see next week whether it's our problem. We may be invited to a solitary, aesthetic life, a suburban life, and in that be great. But there may be a few who are called to a meta quest on a quite different level. And unless there are a few, this state I keep talking about will be pushed further and further back. So our task next week then is to move towards a rediscovery of the elements and our own place in the cosmos. The question we started with, my way? What is my way? Is my way to be a contribution to this cosmogenetics? Can I face something as large as this? And if I back off, am I backing off like somebody who says, I don't need chemistry? The question of the honest student I talked about, I'm backing off because that's the way I am. There is no possibility of a simpler cosmos. We're in a cosmos of ecological disaster, economic turbulence, international friction, so on. The Zen tradition or the Christian tradition, insofar as they are authentic, cannot stay within a religious conviction without asking what. What is the nature of cosmogenetics? And asking it humbly, each in their own zone, and yet with hope that in fact the cosmos is actually genetic. Think of genetic, the question of the nocturne, the first bars of the nocturne. Think of the tadpole. We have no idea in the tadpole existence of our time, of the frog. It's a large imagination. I kept recalling the notion of maybe, a maybe that reaches out in a way that goes beyond our imagination. And do that with, as I say, the schools. What if we were human in our school system? Wouldn't it be a startling situation? Creative insight.